At dawn, on the 6th of June 1944, the Allied forces in the West made their attempt to liberate Europe from Nazi tyranny. But those thousands of troops who crossed the Channel knew they would be up against one of the largest military engineering projects of all time. The bunkers, pillboxes, and gun batteries of Hitler's Festung Europa.
The Atlantic Wall project was enormous. It was a line of concrete and steel that stretched from the north of the Arctic coast all the way down to the border with France and Spain. It was the first line of defence against the Allies. But would it stand up to the test?
On the 9th of April 1940, Hitler started the second phase of his conquest of Europe, when the German army marched into Denmark and Norway. It was the start of a devastating 3 months for the Western European powers, as one by one the countries fell to the Reich. By the summer, Western Europe and the Atlantic coast were under Nazi control. The following year, in 1941, the Nazis launched a seemingly unstoppable attack into the Soviet Union, marching to the gates of Moscow. The UK stood alone and isolated on the edge of Europe, as the position of the Allies was looking bleak. But at the turn of 1942, things began to look different. The Nazi invasion into the USSR began to falter, stuck fast by the icy eastern winter. And the USA, provoked by the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, entered the war on the side of the Allies. With the might of the US to the west, and a wounded but not yet defeated Soviet Union to the east, Hitler faced the nightmare position of fighting on 2 fronts. In response to this, on March 23, 1942, he issued Directive 40.
In the days to come, the coasts of Europe will be seriously exposed to the danger of enemy landings. Improvements of fortifications are to be so made that the main defensive effort lies in those coastal sectors that are the most probable sites for enemy landings.
The directive tasked the Third Reich with creating a bristling fortress along the Atlantic coastline. This was a static defence network that was meant to be impenetrable to attack. This was the birth of the Atlantic Wall.
Hitler's theory was that a defensive wall on the Atlantic coast would protect his flank facing towards the UK and the USA. This would allow him, in turn, to throw the might of his armies against the Soviet Union, defeat them once and for all before turning his attentions back to the West. This was to be an enormous undertaking, and in order to achieve it, he turned to his gigantic engineering organisation. Organisation Todt. Founded by ardent National Socialist Fritz Todt, he oversaw the biggest civil and military engineering projects in the Reich. From the building of the Autobahn to the Siegfried Line, that defensive line facing the French border. However, the Atlantic Wall would be a project on another level entirely. And the man responsible for it was Organisation Todt's Franz Xaver Dorsch. The question was, where to start?
Nazi High Command were convinced that the Allies would need a major port as a gateway into Europe. So places like Ostend or Calais, or Esbjerg, here in Denmark. And so it was these ports that were bolstered with new defences. They were the first bastions of the Atlantic Wall.
I'm meeting with Rune Edberg, a Danish World War II historian who can tell us more about the Atlantic Wall that was built here around Esbjerg.
People think of the big artillery emplacements on the French coast when they think of the Atlantic Wall. Why did the Nazis fortify all the way up here?
The Germans' main force were on the eastern front, so they had to secure the western front as well, but they didn't have the manpower or resources to keep two big armies on both sides. So that's one of the reasons why they built these bunkers. And especially in Denmark and going up to Norway, it was important to keep that lifeline running, especially because the Germans needed iron ore from Norway. That was shipped down the coast to Denmark, and from Denmark they were taken to Germany. And while they were taking it to Germany, they had to control the coastline, and that's why they built the bunkers here on the west coast of Denmark.
Was there any realistic possibility that the Allies were going to come and invade these beaches?
I think they were quite paranoid at this point in time. The British had already shown that they were able to plant troops in Norway and also in North Africa. So the Germans were quite aware that the Allies actually could attack them on different places around the western part of Europe, especially at the sea. And Denmark wasn't that far from England, so they could possibly see themselves being attacked on the western coast of Denmark also. So they needed the bunkers to cover all areas of the western coast. Every inch of the coast were needed to be fortified.
But why up here in Esbjerg?
Esbjerg is quite special when you look at the west coast of Denmark. It's the only port with a capacity where you can unload troops and material. The other ports in Denmark on the west coast can only be reached by fishing boats, so an Allied invasion on one of the smaller ports wouldn't be possible. Here in Esbjerg, where we are, we're not that far from the German border, and from the German border, we're not far from Hamburg. So it's quite essential to keep Esbjerg.
So Esbjerg was important. How did they defend it?
Esbjerg has that natural advantage that you also have a lot of landscape around the city that can be used as a fortress. If you look behind me, we have the island of Fanø, which covers the whole city of Esbjerg. 300 bunkers were put in place on this island, so that's a good position to cover your port, to have that kind of natural surroundings. You also have a lot of hills around the city, which can be used as a fortification and was used by the Germans. In Esbjerg there were 1,200 bunkers during the war, which is quite a lot when you look back in time and see how small the city was. So it was a huge fortress. It was more like a fortress with a city than a city with a fortress.
So, if the Allies had invaded here, would cities like Esbjerg and other ports have actually held? Would they have been successful as forts?
You can look after D-Day in France and Belgium. A lot of those port cities were attacked by the Allies, and you had a lot of casualties from the Allied sides. And if you look at Esbjerg, it's comparable. Thousands of troops and hundreds of bunkers. It would have been a bloodbath for the Allied forces trying to take control of this important port city.
These port citadels now punctuated the Atlantic coastline, but it became very clear to Nazi high command that there were vast swathes of undefended shoreline still out there. To remedy this, Hitler ordered a new directive. He wanted 15,000 bunkers built along the entirety of the European coast, and he wanted it done in 7 months. An impossible task.
Hitler was now obsessed by his wall. Albert Speer, the Nazi architect, noted that Hitler would be up late at night sketching out bunker designs himself, remarking that his designs met all the requirements of a frontline soldier. Not wishing to question the Führer's wisdom, these designs were often adopted without revision by the Todt engineers. Speer was also concerned about the escalating cost of the project. Billions of Reichmarks, over 17 million cubic yards of concrete and 1.2 million metric tons of iron were used in barely 2 years. Materials and money that were being directed away from Germany's desperate armaments industry. But now this was so much more than just a physical defence.
The The tide of war was beginning to turn for the Nazis, and so the Atlantic Wall became a key piece of propaganda for Goebbels. It was to reinforce and reassure the German people that Germany was still strong, but also show the Allies that they were a force not to be reckoned with.
Hier zeigt Deutschland im 4. Jahr des Krieges die gigantische Stärke seiner Abwehrkraft. Der deutsche Soldat steht auf der Wacht. Er erwartet den Feind.
But behind the film reel footage and the newspaper images of gigantic bunkers defended by Germany's finest troops, questions were being asked about just how effective these static defences would be when so much of Germany's early success had been achieved through Blitzkrieg. Even Field Marshal Gert von Rundstedt, the Commander-in-Chief of Western Forces, remarked that it was merely a propaganda wall, and pointed out that
it doesn't suffice to build a few pillboxes. One needs defense in depth.
Despite this, the building project carried on in earnest. Even more of these bunkers emerged from the sands of Europe to protect the Reich. And Denmark's west coast was no exception.
So Rune, tell me, why of all places would the Nazis build bunkers here?
It was the most westerly point in Denmark. Just across the sea you had Newcastle in England, so it would be a perfect place to land troops.
Yeah, the ground is like concrete here, perfect for tanks coming up and men coming up the beaches. And like you say, I saw a cafe on the way in, it said last point before England. So we really are that close, aren't we?
Yeah, completely correct.
What do you think this bunker would have been used for?
I think it could be some kind of a command center.
Oh, right, okay, so a central node to the smaller bunkers either side.
Yeah, but still placed on the beach, so I wouldn't recommend the high-ranking officers staying down here.
No, that makes sense. It is massive, isn't it?
It really is.
How did they even begin to make these things out of concrete?
It was quite standardized. The Germans had their own system called the Regelbau, which is, you can compare it today to a Lego set actually. So they had specific dimensions to it, so you didn't need any skilled labor to build it. You can actually just find some local farmers and hire them to build it, and then follow that manual.
Was it the same here in Denmark?
It started out like local farmers that was employed, and then when rumors spread around the country that you could earn a good living by working over here, a lot of different people came over here, both skilled workers, construction workers, but we have also examples of academics going over here and trying to lift a shovel and build a bunker.
Oh wow, so this became a really desirable job then, being a bunker builder.
It's like going to the Wild West in the US. Here's just going to the Wild West in Jutland. A construction worker could get twice the amount of money compared to a normal construction work in Copenhagen. So it was quite a good deal to get over here.
How on earth was a structure like this made?
So they had to stir the concrete all around the clock. Actually, they built all around the clock so it wouldn't harden. They put scaffolding outside of it in wood, and then they had carpenters going around and removing the wood, and then they're going to make new forms further down the beaches.
Right, so each one of these would have first been made in a wood frame.
Yeah.
And then filled with concrete.
Yeah, and then removed when it dried, and then move on to the next one.
But how would they have been defended?
In Denmark particularly, they used battleship guns. Obviously, you couldn't use a big cannon against infantry, but you could use it against tanks or ships coming in.
So this isn't just about people landing on the beaches. This is about being able to extend that offence out towards the sea so that they could hit them even before they came to shore.
Yeah, that's the whole thing about it.
How is it best to describe something like this?
You could call it a battleship on land or a tank in the sand.
Well, let's go take a look inside this bunker battleship. Oh, there we go, I can just about get in. This is like a time capsule in here, isn't it?
It really is. The sand has blown in the last 80 years, but you can still get a feeling of how it would have been to be here.
Yeah, how much deeper do you think it would have been?
I think, I'm not that tall, so I'll guess a meter down below the sand.
Yeah, and then you can get through a door. Look at this. We've still got the details on the door.
The original numbers here.
9227 or something. Oh, if you'd served in here, I mean, it's pretty dire, but it gives you a glimpse of what it was like to be in one of these bunkers awaiting an Allied invasion. Even still original bits of paint on the wall. Is that a yellow maybe?
Yellowish color.
It's amazing to think that this was, well, what, built 80 years ago?
Yeah.
Look, you've got the hooks.
They stand the test of time, even though it's rusty now. But,
Yeah. Shall we go through?
yeah, let's do that.
Oh, wow. You mentioned they're being encased in wood, and you've still got the wood in here.
Yeah, you can see Danish quality with the nails here, after German design.
German design, Danish quality. These workers were paid well, but they didn't finish off the job that well, did they? So we've seen this room from the outside, this window. Is this where a machine gunner would have sat?
Yeah, he would sit here and then his assistant would probably be where you are now.
Right, so two people in this tiny room, 365 days a year, come rain or shine.
Yeah, it's like a submarine on sand.
It is, isn't it? It's absolutely tiny. Cool.
Watch your head.
Yeah, good advice.
Despite the efforts of Dorsch and organisation Todt, by the May deadline, only 30% of the 15,000 bunkers that Hitler ordered were complete. Failure was not accepted by Hitler, and Dorsch was relieved of his position at the end of the same year. He was replaced by a man who had proven himself in battle, and a man that Hitler hoped would be able to bring that experience to bear on the enormous Atlantic Wall project. The Desert Fox, Field Marshal Rommel. Rommel was appointed commander of the Afrika Korps in 1941, and he had witnessed firsthand the Allies' ability to plant troops on Nazi-held shores. On assuming the role of General Inspector of Western Defences in November 1943, he immediately took a tour along the length of the Atlantic Wall to inspect the work that had already been done and to assess its effectiveness in any upcoming battles.
Rommel was far from impressed. He knew the battle for Europe was going to be won and lost on these beaches, and the bunkers and the men here were far from up to the job. So Rommel set to his task of trying to improve these defences and make them viable for the defence of Europe.
Albert Speer remembered one particularly blunt conversation between Hitler and Rommel after his tour of the Atlantic Wall. He was critical of the design of the bunkers and said,
"We must repulse the enemy at his first landing site. The pillboxes around the ports don't do the trick. Only primitive but effective barriers and obstacles all along the coast can make the landing so difficult that our countermeasures will be effective."
Rommel continued the bunker building that Dorsch had started the previous year, but instead of spreading them across the length of the beaches, they were organised into Widerstandsnest, resistance points. This allowed the bunkers to work in concert with one another and concentrate their firepower. And Rommel started a mass project of littering Europe's beaches with those primitive barriers that he had previously mentioned to Hitler. Czech hedgehogs and Belgian gates would ensure the Nazis dictated where the Allies would land if they wanted to get into Europe, and minefields would be packed into areas that were less well defended by bunkers. In Denmark alone, over 1.5 million mines were planted. The Atlantic coast was to be turned into a kill zone for invading Allied forces. In the end, Rommel had less than a year to implement his changes. On the 6th of June 1944, just 7 months after he became Inspector General, the Allies launched their attempt to liberate Europe. The Atlantic Wall would finally face its ultimate test.
The Allies, of course, would invade in Normandy, where bunkers like this and pillboxes would provide some level of defence, yet the overwhelming Allied force would eventually break through. This would be a fatal blow for Hitler and his Third Reich.
The Atlantic Wall project was fatally flawed, its scale too large, and despite the efforts of Rommel, the line of defence was just too thin to withstand an invasion on the scale of D-Day. After more than 2 years in the making, the wall was punctured in less than a day. But it's important to remember that the Allies also outthought the Germans. They didn't want to test their invasion fleet up against any of the heavily defended ports, and instead developed their ingenious Mulberry harbours, which allowed them the luxury of finding more lightly defended sectors of the Atlantic Wall to attack. Ultimately though, the effectiveness of the wall could only be tested in battle, and once it failed, there was no way back. The thousands of men and guns that were here in Denmark and in Norway, the Netherlands and Belgium, set in concrete and facing towards Britain, were rendered useless.
The Atlantic Wall failed in its primary purpose, to protect the Third Reich, but despite the best efforts of man and nature, it still stands today as a lasting monument to the Second World War.
Just before dawn, on the 10th of May 1940, the largest concentration of motorised vehicles in history roared into action. After months of quiet, it was the start of Hitler's invasion of the West. What followed next was devastating, a stunning combination of new tactics and new technologies. Hitler's generals didn't just launch a massive attack into Western Europe, they launched a new era in the history of warfare. Britain and France were left reeling. Rarely have two mighty imperial powers been so completely defeated in such a short amount of time. Within 6 weeks, France signed a humiliating armistice. The continent of Europe was effectively in the hands of the Nazis, and Britain and her empire stood alone. It was 6 weeks that led to the conquest of Western Europe, 6 weeks that shaped the course of the 20th century.
Now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany.
In September 1939, Britain, France and their possessions across the oceans declared war on Germany in response to Hitler's invasion of Poland. By the end of the month, almost 150,000 men of the British Expeditionary Force, the BEF, had landed in France to bolster the massive French army. These French forces began to probe into Germany's lightly defended western frontier. Hitler was deeply concerned that he would face all-out war on 2 fronts. But outmoded French tactics, which relied cautiously on heavy artillery cover, slowed any invasion of Germany to a snail's pace. the French attack paused, and with the rapid collapse of Poland, French troops were withdrawn as German reinforcements from the east flooded back west. With the conquest of Poland now complete, and with his agreement with Stalin in place, meaning there was no threat from the east, he could turn his attention to the west. But that would be a very different proposition. Hitler was desperate to avoid the fate that had met Germany in the First World War, getting bogged down in a war of attrition, stalemate, trenches that stretched from the Channel coast to the Swiss Alps. So he wanted a quick, decisive victory. But how could he do this? Because he had less tanks, guns and men than the Western Allies. Hitler and his generals spent the winter months in a feverish back and forth about the best way to mount their offensive. The success of the German campaign against Poland the previous year persuaded Hitler to listen to the urgings of his more aggressive generals, most proponents of the new Blitzkrieg. What he agreed to was one of the most daring and unorthodox operational plans in military history. Deployment Directive Fall Gelb, Case Yellow. The plan would see the Germans start their attack along the same route that their fathers had taken in 1914. A big sweep down through Belgium, looking to drive into France through the Pas-de-Calais. Just like 1914, the Germans expected the Allies to march forward to meet them on the fields of Flanders. Except, this time, once the Allies had committed their best troops in the north, the Germans would launch a massive surprise attack through an area known as the Ardennes. The Germans knew the French believed this area was impenetrable to large-scale military operations, and so it was only lightly defended. The powerful Maginot Line ended some 20 kilometres to the east of the sector, and the men on the line were older, B-class divisions, underarmed and underprepared. The German commanders wanted their armoured spearhead to crash into France through this flimsy border, cross the Meuse River and drive hard all the way to the Channel, roughly following the Somme River. The speed of the action would trap the Allied forces in a pocket that could then be crushed by the advancing German forces. It was an audacious plan. It was a risky plan. The Ardennes is a steep, hilly piece of countryside, heavily forested with narrow roads winding through it and deep ravines with fast-flowing rivers at the bottom. It's not good territory for Blitzkrieg, which involves spreading out, bypassing strongpoints, surrounding and destroying them. If the Allies found out the Germans were moving through there, they could turn these narrow avenues of advance into killing zones with aerial bombardment and artillery. But it could also be the quiet back door into France. It was risky. Hitler decided to go for it. As winter turned to spring in 1940, the German army began assembling a vast strike force. Right along the German border, facing the Low Countries and France. Nothing like it had ever been seen in the history of warfare. The German armies bristled with modern tanks like the Panzer Mark III and IV. They were outnumbered and outgunned by French tanks like the monster B-1. But what they lacked in firepower they more than made up for, with better speed, optics and communications. These would be decisive if Fall Gelb was to succeed. The Allies now knew that an invasion of the West was a question of when rather than if. French planners had long discussed the best way to defend against a future German attack. By 1939, those discussions had evolved into the Dial Plan. Allied forces would dig themselves in along the Dial River in Belgium. This plan allowed for British, French and Belgian troops to link up with the friendly Dutch forces and defend together against the most likely route of German invasion. The biggest issue that France and Britain faced, however, was the staunch neutrality of Belgium and the Netherlands. This plan relied on total cooperation, but until Nazi Germany invaded and the Belgians and Dutch asked for support, the masses of British and French troops could do nothing but wait on the French border. It meant that the solid defensive line on the Dyle could not be prepared in advance of an invasion, and the French and British troops would have to race to dig in.
Fall gelb. 5:35 Uhr. Fall gelb, 5:35 Uhr.
Just before dawn on the 10th of May 1940, hundreds of German bombers took off from airstrips across Western Germany. Their target were vital strongpoints, railheads, fortresses in Holland, France and Belgium. Paratroopers were dropped to secure important points, and a swarm of fighters went aloft to stop Allied spotters from looking down on a vast column of armour that was heading through Luxembourg into the Ardennes.
Im Jahr 1940 standen wir vor der Aufgabe, den Durchbruch durch die verlängerte Maginot-Linie bei Sedan zu vollziehen.
At the tip of that particular spear was General Heinz Guderian's 19th Armoured Corps, with 745 armoured fighting vehicles. Supported by Stuka dive bombs that would act as airborne artillery, sticking close to the lead tanks and delivering 250 kilos of high explosive bombs onto any enemy strongpoints. Behind them were over 41,000 other vehicles, bringing up men and supplies for the advancing army. Facing this formidable opponent, there were two French armies of infantry on this front. For the most part, they were underprepared and under-equipped. Remember, this was supposed to be a quiet sector. They had about 250 tanks, but they were parcelled out in small groups along a 60-mile front to support the infantry, making them, frankly, useless. Within 4 hours of the invasion starting, Luxembourg had been swamped and Guderian's fast armoured cars were already entering Belgium. The main break on the tempo of the advance was just the narrow roads and the sheer volume of traffic. After 24 hours, there was a queue of vehicles stretching 120 miles, and some units were yet to even leave Germany. The Luftwaffe was maintaining careful watch on the skies above, but some Allied spotter planes did get through and reported activity in the Ardennes, which Allied High Command dismissed as a feint. So far, Fall Gelb was working. On the morning of the 12th of May, 48 hours since the start of the attack, Allied resistance in the village of Bouillon on the French-Belgian border collapsed. The report says the infantry were fat and flabby 30-somethings with slack discipline. They collapsed and fled when German armoured vehicles approached from the rear. In the north, the Dutch army was fighting a desperate rearguard action as the Germans swept across the country. And in Belgium, Fort Ebenemer was one of the most modern fortresses in Europe, and yet it fell to the Nazis. The British and French needed the Belgians to hold off the Germans for several weeks to allow the Dial plan to get into action. 2 days into the attack, the Allied plan for defence was already in tatters. By nightfall, lead German elements were taking up position on the River Meuse. General Rommel was at Dinant and some of his men crept across a weir to gain a foothold on the far side. To the south, General Guderian was at Sedan. Opposite him, the French desperately brought up troops to reinforce the B-class division that was in place. They hoped the Germans would not be ready for several days to attack across the river while they waited for their heavy guns to be dragged into place. That was wishful thinking. At 10 o'clock, the full might of the German Blitzkrieg was unleashed against the French defenders at Sedan. First came 90 Stuka bombers. They attacked artillery positions. Then Dornier horizontal bombers came to pound any French defences they could find. They were joined by more Stukas who came screaming out of the sky, their sirens terrifying defenders below, raining down bombs and bullets on individual positions. It was the biggest concentration of German air power in the invasion of the West so far. At 4 in the afternoon, German combat engineers dragged their heavy rafts down to the bank and began paddling across the river. Amazingly, only 56 French casualties were reported as a result of the bombardment, and most of the bunkers were still functional. But communications were shattered, as well as the nerve of the defenders, and many fled before the German ground assault reached them. There were some pockets of resistance, but that was quickly mopped up. The defensive line on the Meuse was broken. Pontoon bridges were placed across the river and German troops swarmed across, ready to break up any French counterattacks. Despite some pockets of resistance, the French were overwhelmed. Defeat turned into rout as many of their troops threw away their weapons and fled. The 14th of May would prove to be a particularly dark day for the Allies. The Luftwaffe launched a devastating bombing raid on the Dutch city of Rotterdam and effectively razed it to the ground. Fearing further appalling loss of life to the civilian population should the war continue, the Dutch government capitulated. The north flank of the Allied defences had collapsed. By now, the Allies were retreating right along the line, and Hitler at this stage became worried that the German troops were advancing too fast. They might become overextended and vulnerable to counterattack. He ordered them to slow down. But Guderian was sure that he could sniff the total collapse of the Western Allies. So, through some deception and sort of artistic interpretation of Hitler's orders, he kept pushing his men as hard as they could towards the Channel coast. It was the start of the breakout. On the 15th of May 1940, the new British Prime Minister Winston Churchill received a call from the French Premier, Paul Reynaud. He said, "We are defeated. We are beaten. We have lost the battle." Churchill desperately tried to rally his opposite number, reminding him of the defence of Paris in 1914 when all seemed lost. Nevertheless, Churchill, who'd been Prime Minister for just 5 days, took the decision to get to France as soon as possible. On the 16th of May, Churchill flew to Paris to meet Reynaud and senior French commanders like General Maurice Gamelin. Churchill realised immediately something was not right. The French were burning their papers and getting ready to flee from Paris. Churchill said to Gamelin, "Where is your strategic reserve?" And Gamelin replied, "Aucune." There is none. Churchill later described it as one of the most shocking moments of his life. Churchill asked where the Allies would launch a counterattack. He got the reply, inferiority of numbers, inferiority of equipment, inferiority of methods. The French deployed their best units in the north against the German advance into Belgium. They were now hundreds of miles away from Guderian's hammer blow through the Ardennes and unable to do anything about the German breakout. Charles de Gaulle, leading the French 4th Armoured Division, did have some success while using his tanks as a concentrated unit, causing the German advance to slow, but ultimately he too would be overwhelmed. By the 19th of May, the Germans were on the move again. They smashed through 2 fairly weak British Territorial Army divisions on the Somme, and the following day, the reconnaissance unit of the 2nd Panzer Division reached Noyelles-sur-Mer. The German army was on the Channel coast. The noose was tightening round the neck of the British and French. The Allies were now in disarray. They were desperate to break out of the pocket the Germans had created, but communications between the nations was breaking down. The French launched an attack at Cambrai. Unbeknown to them, the British launched one at Arras. Despite some initial successes, they too were unable to break through German lines. On the 23rd of May, Lord Gort, head of the British Expeditionary Force in France, ordered a retreat from Arras and made the decision to head to the Channel ports. They needed to escape. For the British troops trapped in this enclave, it was now a matter of survival. Guderian was still acting against the spirit of commands he was receiving from higher up. They were telling him to slow down, but he could sense that British defeat was imminent. He wanted to try and encircle, perhaps capture intact the entire BEF. On the 25th of May, Boulogne fell. The following day, the 26th, it was Calais' turn. All British efforts were now directed at protecting the last of the Channel ports. On the evening of the 26th of May, Winston Churchill ordered the evacuation of the BEF from Europe, using the port of Dunkirk. It was the start of Operation Dynamo. For a week, the Allies poured into the area around Dunkirk. Hundreds of thousands of men of the BEF and the French army went down onto the beaches and were picked up by vessels of all kinds. Thames steamers, pleasure boats and ferries that had heeded the call of the Royal Navy to get the men back to the safety of England. Churchill and the British High Command had expected they might be able to evacuate around 45,000 men from the port. But the sacrificial efforts of the French, British and Belgian troops to slow the German advance, and the heroic efforts of the Royal Navy, meant that almost 350,000 men were saved. It was a humiliating retreat for the Allies. Belgium was forced to surrender. The British and French, who had managed to escape, had to leave behind most of their equipment: guns, ammunition, supplies and vehicles. And hundreds of thousands of men, including the best French units, had been killed or were captured by the Germans. Once the pocket on the Channel coast had been stamped out, the Germans could turn their attention to the rest of the French army. This next phase they called Fall Rot, Case Red. General Weygand didn't think that he could match the German army right across the line, so instead he decided to turn towns and villages into individual strongpoints, like breakwaters, hoping to slow the spread of the German advance. The French use of their armour slowly improved. They were able to slow the Germans down this time, but it was the Germans' all-arms attack, including their Luftwaffe, which simply overwhelmed the French ability to withstand them. On the 10th of June, Paris was declared an open city, and on the 14th, the German army marched into the French capital. The German army marched on, surrounding the fortresses of the Maginot Line, causing them to surrender and pushing further and further south into France. On the 16th of June, the French Prime Minister Paul Reynaud resigned his position. He was replaced by Marshal Philippe Pétain. He immediately announced his intention to sign an armistice with the Germans. As soon as he heard that the French government wanted an armistice, Hitler knew that he would drag them to the forest of Compiègne, where, in November 1918, the exhausted German army had agreed to the armistice that had ended fighting in the First World War. In fact, he went one step further. He forced the French delegation into the same railway carriage that the Germans had signed that fateful document in. The French agreed and signed. Fighting finished on the morning of the 25th of June 1940. The fall of France was complete. France was carved in two, with the occupied north and the so-called free zone of Vichy France in the south. And what now began was 4 terrifying years as the French people had to survive beneath the yoke of Nazism. By the end of June, Britain and its empire were standing alone against Nazi Germany. It would only be a matter of time before British people in communities right across the country would feel the might of German assault. As Winston Churchill famously said in his finest hour speech,
"What General Weygand called the Battle of France is over. I expect that the Battle of Britain is about to begin."
It's 1940, and the world's first real air battle is being fought in the skies of the UK. This is the Battle of Britain, in which the Royal Air Force would triumphantly fight off the threat of the German Luftwaffe.
The success of our pilots is not automatic. Their skill and the quality of our aircraft have combined brilliantly to evolve certain successful tactics.
Behind the brave pilots and pioneering technology lies an often forgotten secret weapon, a system that was developed by the RAF here at Bentley Priory in North London. It was this system that would deliver that decisive victory. To find out more about the system that helped win the battle, I've come to meet historian Stephen Bungay. Stephen, how are you?
Dan, hi, I'm fine.
Here we are. Hurricane, fighter, Bentley Priory. This is the place to come and talk about the Battle of Britain.
This is the place to be in August, 80 years on. Yes, absolutely.
Because in that summer of 1940, I mean, we'll talk more about it inside, but this was the absolute centre of Britain's effort against the Luftwaffe.
Absolutely. This was headquarters of Fighter Command. Beautiful building, as you see, long illustrious history. It was a girls' school at one time. But in 1936, it was acquired by the Royal Air Force for a new purpose. And in July of that year, a rather tall, dour-looking man dressed in civilian clothes and a bowler hat walked in and was stopped by one Sergeant Caldthwaite, who asked him what he was doing there. And he said, "My name's Dowding. I'm the Commander-in-Chief. May I have a look around, please?" From that time, for the next 5 years, he led a group of hundreds of people who worked on creating the first integrated air defence system in the world, which is the key to our victory in the Battle of Britain.
Well, let's talk about the summer of 1940, 80 years ago, as we're standing here now. You've got a catastrophic defeat in Europe.
Yep.
And that's what leads to this decisive battle in the airs above Britain.
Absolutely. So in May 1940, Germany invades France, where the BEF is as well, and defeats it in less than 6 weeks. It's a tremendous shock to us and the French, but also a huge surprise to the Germans. And they suddenly find themselves arrayed along the Channel coast with only one enemy left, Britain. Now, Hitler never wanted war with Britain at all. He wrote so as early as Mein Kampf. He says, Germany's 2 natural allies are Italy and Great Britain. Britain is a global maritime power. Germany is a continental land power. We both hate the communists. We'll divide things up. All he wanted from us was that we give him, as the phrase goes, a free hand in the East to deal with the Soviets. And we said no. And he couldn't understand why, and believed that he could make the British see reason. And interestingly enough, there were a number of British politicians who agreed with him. It was pointless to carry on the war. Most of all, Lord Halifax, who was foreign minister at the time. Most of the foreign officers wanted to make peace. Churchill said no, with great support from the Labour Party, but it was touch and go as to whether we'd stay in it or not. Churchill rallied the nation, leaving the Germans to think, well, what are we going to do with them now? And they basically got 2 options. They can either isolate Britain and conduct a siege, but that's pretty difficult. They're not really equipped for it. They need to build loads of U-boats, close the sea lanes. They probably have to do something down the Middle East to cut off our oil supplies, and it's going to take a hell of a long time. And Hitler is a man in a big hurry. They're worried that the Soviets could attack them if they don't do so first. The other one is fast. go for a decision. You either make peace, Brits aren't playing the game, or you threaten to invade them. Very difficult thing to pull off. In fact, from a maritime point of view, it looks pretty hopeless, but there is one precondition that has to be fulfilled under any circumstances. The Luftwaffe has to gain air superiority, otherwise invasion and siege actually are both off the table. And so begins, in a slow build-up in the months of June and July, what we today call the Battle of Britain, and we all know it as an air battle. But at the time, it wasn't clear it was just going to be an air battle at all. It was actually a battle over the vital strategic decision of the war. Who is Germany going to be fighting? Is it going to be just the Soviet Union, or is the West going to continue to be involved?
Yeah, I often think that about the so-called Battle of Britain, because actually it was designed just to be sort of phase one of this much larger strategic effort.
That's right.
But there was never a phase two.
There was never a phase two.
These hurricanes and
because
stuff like, yeah.
These guys put pay to it. No,
Yeah.
that's right. I mean, it's often said that that saved us from invasion. We will never know whether the Germans would have invaded or not, even if they had gained air superiority. Frankly, the plans, Operation Sea Lion, were all set up to be about the greatest military disaster in German history. There'd probably been a naval massacre in the Straits of Dover, but that wasn't really the issue. The issue was, were we going to continue in the war? And if they'd won and been able to threaten London with round-the-clock bombing against which we could do absolutely nothing, there was a very strong peace lobby in the House of Commons that would have got up and said to Churchill, look, you've tried hard, well done, but we've got to make peace. We cannot subject people like this. I think that's the most likely outcome of our losing, whatever losing meant.
And this is where it all happened.
Well, a good part of it happened, yes. This is Headquarters Fighter Command, and one of the key things that happened here was processing information that came in from radar. But the way it worked is absolutely brilliant, conceptually far ahead of the time. This system is in fact the ancestor of the internet we know today,
Right.
but we're going to talk about that inside.
Bit Spartan,
Well, here we are. This is Dowding's headquarters, his office, his telephones.
What's exciting about this space is he built and designed this system, and then he operated it all from here, from this desk.
Yeah, well, he made big calls, I suppose. He kept himself out of day-to-day operations. He made sure that they were working properly. His main job in the summer of 1940 was making sure that Fighter Command was properly resourced, you know, getting pilots from elsewhere, from Training Command, beating up the training units to provide them, making sure that aircraft production supply were working, but they weren't really a problem. And then working on new problems. So he was, as it were, thinking about the next battle while other people were fighting this one, and he spent an inordinate amount of time on night air defence and working out how to do that, because at the time, in the summer of 1940, we were helpless at night. We had absolutely nothing.
You're kidding me.
No,
So
that's
during
absolutely
the
what it
height
is.
of the Battle of
height of the
Britain,
battle,
Sir Hugh Dowding was busy thinking about the blitz
the
that
next
was to
one.
come.
Yeah, the one that was to come.
No.
He actually wrote a letter that he had distributed across Fighter Command to his fighter boys, as he called them, saying, you know, you're not going to be seeing very much of me over the coming months, but my thoughts will always be with you, and I'm working on some other things to help you. So, you know, over to Keith Park, as it were.
To his subordinates.
To his subordinates.
Okay, well, let's take it right back. He's sitting here in the late 1930s. He's scribbling out, he's typing out. What are the decisions he makes, and how do those win the Battle of Britain?
Okay, well, his main decisions at that time are really about putting the whole system together. He's got scientific committees working. He's got to sort out things to do with aircraft armament. He started his time in research and development. So an awful lot of it was about managing technical experts and putting it all together in such a way that the whole thing worked. He had to work with civilian organisations, such as the Post Office, which at the time contained what we now know as BT as well. thousands and thousands of miles of telephone cable were laid. Power had to be got to the operations rooms right across the country. And you had to make sure the national grid didn't fall apart. It was a bloody good job we had a national grid, actually, because a lot of countries didn't. They had regional grids. Without the national grid, very difficult to say whether the whole thing could have worked or not. He was commissioning people to build underground bunkers. He got this place armoured and he put the filter room down there. Thousands and thousands of things he had to deal with. He had to deal with
talking for the Supermarine company that made the Spitfires.
Yeah, no, he was involved in all that, in the specification that led to the Spitfire and the Hurricane, how many guns they were going to have, you know, the 8-gun decision. He was a part of that. And yet, at the same time, he has this vision of how this thing can all work. So at the same time, it's very unusual to find this in one person. He's very detail-orientated and very practical, and very visionary and very conceptual. Usually you find people are one or the other, and he was both. That was the characteristic of his genius. And then, of course, when the threat comes, he has to work out how to deal with it. So he's got all these resources, how's he going to deploy them? And that comes down to strategy. Now, what you do as a defender is going to depend on what the other guy's going to do. So what are the Germans trying to do? Well, the problem they have is that they never really made up their minds. So are we going to cut England off and lay siege? Are we going to seek a political decision? Or are we going to prepare for an invasion? Fighter command strategy was very, very clear. You could formulate it by saying that Dowding and Park together said, we're going to defeat every serious raid in order to deny the enemy air superiority. We're just going to inflict a price on every incursion into British airspace with bombers that can do damage. Send over fighters, that's fine. They can burn up petrol at 30,000 feet over Kent if they like, and then go home. We'll leave them. They want us to come up and fight big air battles with their 109s. We're not going to play their game. They're going to force them to play our game. You send a bomber over and there's Spitfires and Hurricanes all over it. But you leave the fighters alone. And they keep going. The idea is you retain the ability to keep going, whatever they do, indefinitely. So you conserve your own strength. And eventually the other lot are going to realize they're getting nowhere and give up. There was an alternative idea, which was to try to engage in large air battles in order to inflict large casualties. But that's actually what the Luftwaffe wanted us to do. And big air battles don't actually cause high percentage casualties. They're just very confusing. There's no such thing as decision in an air battle. It's always attrition. So the clarity of that message filtered on down right into the way they ran operations.
Dowding knew that coordinating this defence would need a new kind of command system. And the heart of that system was here at Bentley Priory. So this is a sort of reconstruction, is it?
Yes, that's right. So this is showing the sort of thing that used to go on downstairs in the filter room. To know what that is, you've got to get an idea of what this system was designed to do. The military would call it a C3 system, command, control and communications, but you can think of it as basically an information processing and communications system. So this is the Dowding system, and it consists of 5 elements. The first element is the information gathering system, which is from the radar stations on the outside and the observer core. That information is fed in here. So headquarters fighter command is the information processor, and the key thing is the filter room. So it's working out what all these blips on the radar mean, how many raids there are, because you're getting the different radar stations getting the same raid, what height they're flying at, that was one of the hardest things to estimate, and their strength and their trajectory, where they were going to. And they're all laid out on the plotting table here.
So the plotting table is, we now are so familiar with the air traffic control, with the screen, and this is just this is the first great airspace management system.
That's basically what it is.
So, here at HQ, they were able to combine all the different sources of information into a detailed picture of the entire enemy attack. But what's really surprising is what happens next.
They make no decisions about what to do about the raids. They pass the information down to the 4 groups The groups decide what aircraft to bring against what raid when and in what strength. And because they've got too many aircraft to handle themselves, that information is then passed on to the sector stations, each of which have about 3 squadrons. And they're the guys who ring the bell to run like hell and get up there. And therefore, they communicate with the fifth element, which are the Spitfires and Hurricanes themselves and the pilots in the squadrons. They, as it were, form the tip of the spear, but it's the strength of the shaft of the spear that makes the tip so deadly.
So it's fascinating because the clue should be in the title. We're here in Fighter Command Headquarters, but they're not doing that much commanding.
No, they're not. They're actually not doing any commanding at all. They're doing information processing. The commanding is being done here at Group. Command is giving direction, telling people what to do. The overall strategy, defeat every serious raid in order to deny air superiority, has already been fixed. It's in everybody's head. That comes from Dowding. Then he stops. He doesn't interfere. And then if you consider the number of things that have to be done, I mean, when you're controlling squadrons, you've got to know where your guys are. So they had another system called Pipsqueak that's sending information back here that has to be processed on another frequency. And then they got the IFF system, the Identification Friend and Foe system, working for them as well. You imagine trying to get all that at a national level in this room? Forget it. Part of the genius of this system is that it realizes what work needs to be done by whom. Everybody knows exactly what their role is. They don't interfere with each other. They trust each other, but everybody is working on a common shared understanding of what is going on. And that, I have to say, is a key to operational effectiveness in any business organization today, just as much as it was for then. And there's a lot of them could learn a lot of lessons from this.
When the alarm does come, not a second is lost.
Giving the individual squadrons the freedom and the information to make their own decisions was a radical break from the very hierarchical way military campaigns had been organised in the past. This was a new approach, suited to a new age. For much of military history, you think about Napoleon in Russia, the problem is complete lack of information. You've got no idea what your enemy's doing. We're now entering that very modern world that we all know very well today. We've got far too much information coming out.
Yes. There was some uncertainty around the information. The most dodgy bit of information was height. Hard to estimate, and pilots knew that, so they always used to, if they're ordered to patrol at 15,000 feet, they'd make it 18 just to be sure, because they wouldn't be on top. And there were missed interceptions because of that, because they're going up too high. But generally, it gave them a vivid, real-time view of the battlefield, which is something a commander had never had before.
I'm so struck by all of these being connected by phone lines, and you've pointed out in your books that it was almost impossible to destroy this network.
So if you think of a traditional command and control system as used in the First World War, you have a telephone line from the brigadier down to the battalion headquarters in the front line. The next minute a shell lands and cuts the line, dead, they're cut off. Command and control is no longer possible. However, if you cut a bit of a net, the information flows around the whole. So even if you manage to take out one of the operations rooms at the sector level, then the information flowed down around it. So one stage, Biggin Hill went down for an afternoon, so Kenley and Hornchurch took over control of the squadrons. The Germans noticed nothing.
Like today's internet, Dowding's information network was highly resistant to attack. And his system proved devastatingly effective. The British fighters were being used so efficiently that it was almost as if they had twice as many planes, giving them the advantage over the Luftwaffe.
Air battles over Britain are generally short, and they generally end the same way. The Nazis either run for home or else they're shot down.
Stephen, what I find so inspiring about the Dowding system is it's such a clever, wonky, technocratic response. But at the sharp end of it, there are unbelievably brave young men sweating and fighting and dying and bleeding.
The fighter boys, yes, absolutely. And I was privileged to get to know some of them. They certainly were remarkable chaps, but one of the things that struck me really powerfully was their modesty, in that, I mean, it was against the ethos of fighter command to shoot a line, as it were, to show off. It was sort of the opposite of profiling yourself on Facebook today. And they all played it down because they understood that they were part of a bigger whole. Yeah. And you know, how did you manage to do it? Oh, well, I was just doing my job. I mean, one of the guys I got to know first was this fellow here. That's a portrait of him from the time, who was Bob Doe. He tells his story of being the worst pilot in the squadron. He said, I was the worst pilot in the squadron. I didn't like being upside down, he said, but, you know, the 13th of August came, and there he was in 10 Group. The airfield had been bombed, and then they were scrambled. And I said, so what persuaded you to take off? He said, well, I knew I was going to die, he said, but I was more afraid of being thought a coward. So he took off and stuck to his leader, and he came back having shot down 2 ME-110s. He's one of the many who told me that he hates being thought of as a hero, so I was just doing my job.
But he's right, because of the Downing system, he's right that he was obviously incredibly brave, tenacious, accurate, but he was put in the right equipment, in the right place,
at the right time,
by a bigger system. Whereas, of course, the Germans were hero worshippers, weren't they? That was the whole, it was a heroic system.
Now, well, you make the point. Here's the one German I got to know, Ulrich Steinhilfer, who flew in JG-52, and before the war he was in the same unit as Adolf Galland, and not to put too fine a point on it, he hated Gallant's guts. He was sadistic. He used to tie his dog in front of a wood-burning stove to torture it during the winter, apparently, and arrogant and cared only about himself. He's what fighter boys would call a prima donna.
German aces like Adolf Galland were individualists who frequently disobeyed orders in pursuit of their own personal tally of kills.
They didn't even want radios in their aircraft. They said it would add weight, and they didn't want anyone on the ground telling them what to do. So more different an ethos you couldn't get. Yeah? It's this warrior hero mentality that they had that was part of the reason for their demise. These guys didn't care that much, except for a few of them did. Most of them didn't care that much about what their individual scores were, whereas that's all that seemed to matter to some of the German pilots, some of the aces. And of course, it was also, in many ways, a meritocracy. I mean, that's a famous figure up there. That's Ginger Lacey. Now, Ginger was son of, I think, a butcher from Yorkshire, and he was a sergeant pilot. And he flew with 501 Squadron, but he was the best pilot on the squadron. And once they were in the air, they followed him. On the ground, they had a separate mess for the sergeants. They weren't supposed to mix with the officers and gentlemen, you see, mix with butcher sons from Yorkshire. But up in the air, it was meritocratic, and of course, he was promoted afterwards. And gradually, these class distinctions wore away, but they're very strong, of course, initially.
Last thought, surrounded here by the pictures of some of the more famous of the few. What did this victory mean? What did the Battle of Britain mean?
Well, the Battle of Britain is often said victory prevented invasion. It certainly put the seal on invasion because it was a necessary but not sufficient condition of the invasion taking place. I think the German Navy breathed a sigh of relief when it was postponed. But I think the most important thing was that it strengthened Churchill's position in Parliament. After the Battle, Churchill's position was pretty much untouchable. There were a couple of votes of no confidence later in the war, because the war continued to go from bad to worse. But they were very easily defeated. And that meant that we were going to continue fighting. It also was the first time that Hitler had actually suffered a reverse. They pretended they hadn't, but it was pretty clear to everyone that they finally met their match. And it had an important effect in the United States. We exploited its propaganda value in the US in particular for all it was worth, because one of the main planks of Churchill's grand strategy was to get the US involved. He knew once the US entered on our side, it was only a matter of time. So he used all this. It got an awful lot of sympathy, especially the Blitz got a lot of sympathy. Ed Munro's reports and so on went all around the US. And if there is one point in time, if I were asked to pinpoint the time when Germany lost the war, I would surprise everybody by saying it was July 1940, because that's when they decided to attack Russia without having cleared their backs by defeating or coming to terms with Britain. That means they would have been in a two-front war, and every general in Germany knew that a two-front war was a war that Germany was going to lose, and they walked into it.
Thanks to the Dowding system and the tireless efforts of those in the air and on the ground, Britain maintained mastery of its skies. And on the 17th of September 1940, Hitler gave the order to suspend invasion plans until further notice.
Londoners had several air raid warnings about this, and bombs were dropped in the suburbs, but the main attacks were beaten off with terrific losses to the enemy. Thousands of pounds worth of scrap is being recovered here, and so eventually the Nazi bombers may return to Germany in a form the Germans won't appreciate. Anyway, there's the graveyard of Hitler's first Blitzkrieg on Britain.
It was Hitler's first major defeat of the war. It wouldn't be his last. The night was freezing cold, the hard ground shrouded in mist, and by dawn, soldiers were on the move. It was the 2nd of December 1805, and here on this rolling landscape just outside what is now Brno in the Czech Republic, three mighty armies were about to fight one of the greatest battles in history. By the time the sun set on that short December day, the French Emperor, Napoleon Bonaparte, had achieved a stunning victory. A victory so decisive that it would set the course of European history for a decade. It was the Battle of Austerlitz. France and Britain were back at war. After a short peace from 1802 to 1803, the two old adversaries resumed their decade-long struggle for mastery. France's leader, Napoleon Bonaparte, declared himself first consul for life, and then, in December 1804, he placed the imperial crown on his head. The European powers were outraged and terrified in equal measure. William Pitt, the Prime Minister of Britain, worked tirelessly to build a mighty coalition of allies to crush this man, whose talent and ambition threatened the whole of Europe. Napoleon responded by striking at the head of the serpent. He encamped his army on the shores of the Channel. He wanted to invade Britain and knock out his most intractable enemy. But his navy could not escape the Royal Navy. In a series of encounters culminating at the Battle of Trafalgar, his ships failed to break free of the British naval blockade and were eventually destroyed by their British opponents. But by the time of Trafalgar, Napoleon and his army were no longer on the Channel coast. They were on the move. They were racing to head off a mortal threat to France. They were heading east. In the summer of 1805, William Pitt's coalition was rumbling into action. Russian and Austrian troops gathered for a massive strike into French-held territory. Napoleon advanced towards them at great speed. Before the Russians and Austrians could join together, he had encircled a huge portion of the Austrian army at Ulm on the Danube, and they surrendered. Tens of thousands of men marched into captivity. Other coalition forces retreated. Pitt's mighty alliance was already in tatters. By mid-November, Napoleon had captured the Austrian capital city, Vienna. But still, the Austrian and Russian armies retreated ever further eastwards. Napoleon followed. By the 20th of November, he'd reached what is now the town of Brno in the Czech Republic. But still, the Austrians and Russians would not fight. What he needed was a decisive battle to bring the campaign to a close. And when he discovered this feature here, this piece of high ground that dominated the surrounding landscape, he thought he could spring a trap and force that decisive battle. Napoleon saw this high plateau above the village of Pratzen. Here was the site to rout his enemies. To encourage them to attack, he stayed put, giving the impression of weakness. Just to the east, in the village of Austerlitz, senior Austrian and Russian commanders were meeting to thrash out their strategy. The Allied commanders staying in this chateau argued between themselves. The young Russian Tsar Alexander had arrived in person and he'd taken over command of the army from his wily, seasoned old general Kutuzov. He was surrounded by arrogant, ambitious, aristocratic young Russian officers, and they urged attack. They wanted glory for Russia, no more retreats. Alexander agreed. Francis of Austria had seen his capital city captured. He'd seen his armies humiliated, and reluctantly, he went along with this ambitious plan. Napoleon was thrilled, but he kept up the pretense. He sent a messenger to the Allied High Command, ostensibly to discuss peace, but in private, he issued a flurry of orders to his subordinates. His army was divided into a series of corps. These were effectively mini armies, and they were each commanded by a trusted veteran. They were spread across this region, but now Napoleon told them to gather, to congregate here. That meant men like Murat, Soult, Lannes and Davout set out on a series of forced marches to get to their emperor. Napoleon's trap was half set. What came next was a masterstroke. Napoleon kept up the pretense of peace negotiations. A Russian prince was invited to discuss terms. He was carefully shown on his way French troops withdrawing, and he was shown, importantly, that the French had left that big hill over there completely undefended. In glee, the Russian prince galloped back to inform the Allied High Command. As Napoleon pulled back, he took his subordinates right across the battlefield and showed them where and how he wanted them to fight the battle. While the Russian and Austrian allies bickered, Napoleon's men knew the ground and knew exactly what the plan was and what was to be their part in it. Napoleon was everywhere that night before the battle, visiting units, wrecking the ground. Just after midnight, in the first few moments of the 2nd of December, he strayed out beyond French lines. He was almost captured by Russian Cossack horsemen. He made it back though, and as he headed to his headquarters, there was a spontaneous outburst of affection from his troops. Groups of them held aloft fiery torches from the fires of their bivouac to guide him on his way. As the sun rose, the Allied situation was pretty chaotic. The leaders had only managed to thrash out their plan in the early hours of the morning, and the orders then had to be translated and delivered to all the different units. To make matters worse, some officers had snuck off to find cosy billets in villages rather than stay with their men in the field, so units were leaderless, and the fog was making things worse. It was not a good start. Napoleon commanded the battle from up here. This was his headquarters. Now, he had left his southern flank down here ostentatiously weak. He wanted the Allies to see that and to direct their main effort down there. That would weaken their centre, which Napoleon would then launch his major strike force against. He would march his men up that plateau over there. That was to be his masterstroke. The Allies took the bait, and the fighting began down there in the south with the Allied attack. The Allies advanced into this village. The French defenders here were outnumbered around 2 to 1. They hadn't made life easy for themselves either. They'd ripped any doors or wooden fittings off the night before to keep the cold at bay, to burn in their fires. It was dominated, this village, by this castle here, and the whole area became a battlefield. People fighting building to building, room to room. Groups of men would loom out of the mist, surprising even people on their own side, often leading to friendly fire incidents.
The fog was so dense that one could hardly see 50 paces. A lively fire could be heard, but one could not differentiate which part of our Allied army was attacking or had been attacked by the enemy.
Fighting was house to house. The French were pushed back. Reinforcements arrived who'd marched virtually non-stop for days. They arrived in the nick of time and stabilised the line. The fighting in and around this castle was unimaginably fierce, but the French were able, just about, to hold their own. The Allies were held. Now, Napoleon could strike in the north. Napoleon was standing right here on this hilltop, and around 8 a.m, the sun burst through the fog, and the top of that plateau over there became clear. Now, the good news for Napoleon was that he could see the Russian troops on that plateau there marching towards the fighting down to the south. Meanwhile, Napoleon's main strike force, 16,000 men, was still hiding unnoticed in this valley down here, obscured by the fog and wood smoke from campfires. At 9 a.m, Napoleon gave the order to advance up that plateau. He turned to Marshal Soult beside him, one of his senior commanders, and said, "One sharp blow and the war is over." The French troops marched up this hill, skirmishers out in front, sharpshooters that could snipe at the enemy and break up their cohesion, followed by massed ranks of infantry, and then behind them, the gunners hauling their cannon up the hill.
But they came out of a clear blue sky. How is it that we have had no warning?
This gigantic French attack crashed into inexperienced Russian troops right up here. They broke and they fled. Not even the Tsar, who was just to the rear, could rally them. One Russian general, though, Kamensky, brought experienced veteran troops to try and stem the French advance. And what followed were 2 horrific hours of fighting. Lines of infantry standing only 50 metres apart, firing massed volleys into each other. Both sides ran low on ammunition. Finally, the tide of the battle was turned by a gigantic French bayonet charge. They closed on the enemy with cold steel and fought hand to hand with artillery in support.
Every discharge of my cannon opened up a great square holes in the enemy lines, and their 4 regiments dispersed in mobs of fugitives.
Kamensky was captured. Many of his men were bayoneted as they fled or lay on the ground wounded. These heights were Napoleon's. As the French seized the all-important heights in the centre of the battlefield, there was also a savage battle being fought to the north. To the south, the Battle of Austerlitz was marked by that vicious house-to-house fighting. In the centre, great masses of infantry would fire muskets at each other at point-blank range. But up here in the north, these fields became infamous for the gigantic cavalry clashes. Just down there, French and Russian horsemen would gallop towards each other, locked together in a mass of men and horses, sabres slashing, lances stabbing, pistols being discharged at close range, punching through breastplates, and then withdrawing, reorganising, and having another go. But the French had an advantage. They worked better with their infantry and their artillery. Now, if you look at the ground I'm standing on here, this has actually been landscaped by French engineers. There were cannon up here that were sending cannonballs scything through Russian ranks in the fields below. And the battle up here eventually was won by the French. Allied units on the north flank were now separated from the rest of the army. Only skillful use of cannon and suicidally brave cavalry attacks prevented a complete collapse. The French were now in a dominant position, but the Allies had one last blow left in them, and it would come here on this high ground that the French had managed to seize, tearing a hole in the centre of the Allied line. It was up here, in these fields here, that the Russians unleashed the Russian Imperial Guard. Grand Duke Constantine, the younger brother of the Tsar, led them in person, 17 squadron of horsemen, all over 6 foot tall, the elite of the Russian cavalry, sworn to protect the Tsar until death if necessary. The Russian cavalrymen charged across this field and slammed into the French line. The French infantry immediately formed squares, allowing them to defend in all directions from the swirling mass of horsemen. One square fired a mighty musket volley and a Russian squadron wheeled away. Another French square, though, was attacked and overwhelmed. It disintegrated. In the melee, the Russian horsemen were able to seize the French Imperial Eagle from a sergeant who fell beneath a shower of sabre blows. It was a Russian triumph, but it would be the only one that day. Napoleon himself was climbing up this slope following the successful line of his attack when suddenly he was surrounded by French fugitives from the square that the Russian cavalry had broken into. He immediately responded. He moved more infantry and cavalry to this part of the battlefield. He sent in his elite force, his Imperial Guard, and soon these two masses of cavalry, French and Russian, both the creme de la creme, were mixed together in a seething, chaotic mass. Eventually, both sides put in their last reserves, but the French managed to push the Russians back across this battlefield. They retreated, leaving behind this field here, churned up by the hooves of horses and littered with the dead and dying men. The Allies were driven back in the north, annihilated in the centre. Napoleon now moved south to turn a victory into a rout.
I was under fierce and continuous canister fire. Many soldiers, now incessantly engaged in battle from 7 in the morning to 4 in the afternoon, had no cartridges left. I could do nothing but retreat.
In the south, there had been a savage stalemate since first light. This village was heaped high with dead. Now Allied commanders looked up to the heights and saw French troops streaming down to surround them. They were staring at defeat.
Our command was wandering about, saying again and again, "Lads, throw your guns away, or they will slaughter us all." But, despite this, our soldiers continued loading and firing. The enemy overwhelmed us.
The Allied troops reeled back across this land here, desperate to avoid being encircled by the French troops that were now flooding in behind them. Down there in that low ground, there were a series of ponds, and they were blocking the way. They were covered in ice. There were small causeways through the ponds, but one of them quickly became snarled up as an ammunition wagon caught on fire, and the soldiers headed out across the ice. Initially, it held their weight, but then as more and more of them went on there, the ice started to crack. And then French artillerymen saw from Pratzen Heights and fired cannonballs down in to smash the ice. Hundreds of troops were sucked down into the freezing, inky darkness. It was 4 p.m. and icy rain fell. The skies darkened. Napoleon urged on his troops to complete the rout of the Allied army, but brave stands by individual cavalry units gave groups of infantrymen the breathing space to escape. The shattered remnant of the Austro-Russian army melted away into the dust. Napoleon rode across this battlefield, trying to comfort some of the many wounded. It was the first anniversary of his coronation as emperor, and he had won a crushing victory. He issued a proclamation to his army that said, "Soldiers, I am pleased with you." Then he wrote to his wife, saying, "I've won a great victory against an Austrian and Russian army commanded by 2 emperors. I'm a little tired." Thousands of men were in a far worse state. The field of Austerlitz was indescribable. Up to 20,000 killed or wounded. The Austrian and Russian armies had been humbled. The Tsar fled the battlefield in tears.
I had previously seen some lost battles. but I had no conception of such a defeat.
Napoleon's victory here forced the Russians to go home. It allowed him to inflict a humiliating peace on the Austrians, stripping them of territory, increasing his grip on Central Europe, and levying a gigantic fine. William Pitt's coalition was destroyed, and when the British Prime Minister heard about this battle in London, he looked at a map of Europe on the wall and ordered it to be rolled up, saying it will not be needed these 10 years. Within a few weeks, William Pitt himself, a broken man, was dead. Perhaps the final casualty of this battle of Austerlitz.